Energy Media readers, we've got another interview about the standoff with the Wetsuweten Nation in British Columbia over the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And that, of course, is grabbing headlines across the country, and as we all know. And so today I'd like to welcome MP Paul Manley from the Green Party, who's coming to us on Family Day from his home in Nanaimo. So welcome to the interview, Paul.
Thanks for having me, Markham.
Now, let me frame the question for you. You issued a press release 3 or 4 weeks ago about how the Wetsuweten hereditary chiefs had made a proposal to the company for a revised pipeline route. And then the company not only rejected it, but they also issued a press release, and they explained why they had rejected it, of course. An extra $800 million in construction costs and some of the other technical issues. And what's your take on that?
Well, originally the press release was really talking about my trip to Wetsuweten, and you know, I met with the hereditary chief, Chief Namax up there, and I traveled around with him for a couple of days. I met with the RCMP detachment commander in Smithers, and I met with the detachment commander at the Community Industry Safety Office, and I took Chief Namax with me there. You know, to have a discussion about trying to resolve this in a peaceful way. And during the traveling around, I learned a lot about Wet'suweten law, and I learned a lot about how they kept their hereditary system alive and their traditions alive through colonization, through the residential schools, and you know, all of that cultural genocide practice. And we talked a lot about the role of the band councils, chiefs and councils, the system that's being created by the government as part of the Colonial Indian Act governance system. And we talked about the role of the hereditary chiefs. And one of the things he said to me was that they had proposed a different route for this pipeline that would have been satisfactory to them. And instead, the pipeline, Coastal GasLink, has plowed right through the Queest Trail, which is a historic trail. It dates back thousands of years. It was originally a war path, and then it became a trading trail. And there's burial grounds on there. There's archaeological sites. It's a pristine wilderness area that they've used for hunting and trapping and cultural teaching, gathering, you know, for time immemorial. And so it's a very important place for them culturally. And I've seen videos of what's happened to that trail. They've run the pipeline like right through it, and you know, right down the trail. And you know, that's a travesty. I think that there should be some potentially an injunction around the desecration of burial grounds and archaeological sites.
So is there a real, even more basic foundational issue here where the project went through an environmental assessment review, and it seems a bit unusual, one would think, that they would eventually, the regulator would approve the construction of that pipeline right down a cultural trail with all of the cultural artifacts that you just discussed. So is that an issue as well, that the regulator, at least under the old rules, wasn't as sensitive to these kinds of issues from the First Nations point of view as we are today?
Well, I think it speaks to a culture of corporate capture, regulatory capture, where the corporations are deciding, you know, they're directly engaged in this process, and you see people from industry who've gone into these positions where they're just making these decisions. And you know, I think that it's been clear that Unist'ot'en have had a camp up there for 10 years. They've had this healing center up there for 5 years. It should be very clear to both levels of government, the provincial and the federal government, that there was clear opposition to this pipeline going through, and especially where it was going through. And so, you know, I called upon the Prime Minister and Premier Horgan 4 weeks ago to come to the table and speak with the Wet'suweten hereditary chiefs, to have an honest dialogue, a nation-to-nation dialogue. And this is what this whole situation was completely avoidable, but also predictable. We know that there's agreements between First Nations across Canada that when one is attacked, they all stand up together.
Now that's very interesting, because I am of the opinion that more effective leadership of the type that you talked about, where the Prime Minister would come and meet with the hereditary chiefs, the Premier would come meet with the hereditary chiefs, and we need that kind of leadership, as opposed to simply allowing the process to play itself out, even though, maybe we're not going to send the RCMP in with riot gear. Nevertheless, that isn't exactly dialogue. It's not engagement. It's not a process to resolve this problem. And this seems to happen over and over and over again. In addition to this sort of ad hoc response to the camp, we have a crisis, we need to get it resolved. What should we do going forward so we don't find ourselves in this position again?
Well, I think we need to make sure that there is proper dialogue and proper consultation and free, prior, and informed consent from those bodies that are recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada. So the Delgamuukw decision recognized the hereditary chiefs of the Wetsuweten and the Gitxsan people. And that decision recognized their rights and title, and they were the plaintiffs in that case. It was not the elected band councils and chiefs that were part of that process. And this Unist'ot'en decision reaffirmed that it's up to First Nations people and indigenous people to determine for themselves how they determine Aboriginal rights and title. And these lands were never surrendered. And so it's incumbent upon government to have these discussions. And when you see an opportunity where, one of the things that Coastal GasLink said was we would have to delay this because we'd have to negotiate with other First Nations. That's the way you have to do business in this country. We have unsurrendered land that we have to negotiate about. This is indigenous land. So
now, you were up there with the chief, and I'm sure you talked to members of the First Nation and all of that. So what's the chief, the hereditary chief's point of view? Are they willing to engage and talk about solutions? Are the nation members willing to engage and talk about solutions, or are they dead set against this project being on their land, the traditional territories, no matter what happens?
Well, they are absolutely open for dialogue, and that's what they had been asking for. When the injunction came down and when there was enforcement order, they asked for dialogue, and they asked for government to government dialogue, nation to nation dialogue. And the federal government is responsible for the relationship with First Nations in this country. They're responsible for the Indian Act. They're responsible for the reserve system. They're the ones that should be at the table. And this was asked for, and instead, we've got a situation where the injunction has been enforced. The process is being done. The pipeline is being built at the barrel of a gun, and that is unacceptable in this day and age in this country. And it's unfortunate, and it should have been. It was completely avoidable. It could have been. They had two alternate pipeline routes, as from what I understand. They had the McDonald Lake route, and they had another route that was that they proposed. And these things take time. If you want to do it right, this pipeline would be in place for decades and decades to come. What is another year in getting the process done right? I mean, with the Green Party, don't get me wrong, I'm opposed to this project anyway, but to trample on the rights of Indigenous people to get it done is beyond the pale.
Okay, fair enough. What role do you think the provincial government, the BC government, and Premier Horgan should play in resolving this?
Well, I think that they're sending envoys and starting to talk now, which is it's late in the game. We've already seen this enforcement go through, and people are First Nations and Indigenous people across this country are really upset about the way this was done. And so, yeah, they need to come to the table and have a discussion with us, because this has set off a firestorm across the country. And if they don't deal with this properly, it's going to gum up our economy a whole lot more. And we're going to see a lot more conflict. And, you know, these massive energy projects, this process of receiving, you know, free, prior, and informed consent, you know, Site C, 14 First Nations were opposed to that project, and 12 of them acquiesced. They, after seeing that the project was going to be forced through and rammed down their throat, they conceded and they accepted the benefits agreement and the money involved. And 2 of them are standing firm. With Teck Resources, we've seen chiefs speaking in the media saying the regulator has never turned down one of these projects. So we might as well get some benefit out of it and try to mitigate the damage as much as possible. But are we happy with it? No, we're not. And so conceding and acquiescing is not consent, and it's not the right process. And I think that the government needs to change the way that they're doing this.
Now, I was on Twitter today and saw a tweet from Aaron O'Toole, who is an MP and a candidate for the leadership of the Conservative Party, calling for the Prime Minister to intervene, get tough, basically send in the police, and end this once and for all. And that seems to me, what's your response to these people? And I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up Brett Wilson, the Calgary-based energy financier, who said it's civil war and we should send in the military. That seems to me as, wow, that's extremist rhetoric and does a lot to damage the chances of resolving this rather than being helpful and fruitful. What's your take?
Yeah, I think that is outrageous. So if you want to start whacking wasps' nests, hornets' nests around the country and getting everybody really upset, that's a good way to do it, is to order the RCMP and the OPP, which, you know, the OPP have experience with Ipperwash and with Caledonia, and they know what they're doing. They know that they need to step through these things carefully, or they're going to set up a problem right across the province and into Quebec, and you know, you can't just trample on the rights of people to push through these energy projects that you want for corporate profit. I mean, the whole thing about this project is misleading to begin with. The idea that fracking is going to, fracked gas sold as LNG is going to replace coal and lower the greenhouse gases emissions of coal is ridiculous, because fracking is hugely dangerous. It releases methane into the atmosphere. It's 80 times more potent in the first 15 years as a greenhouse gas. And all the way down the line, right to when we turn on our stoves and light our stoves, we're releasing methane into the atmosphere. The idea that the royalty rates that are being paid for this stuff are going to pay for hospitals and schools and everything else, we're giving the resource away. The royalty rates in British Columbia are tanked.
Paul, I'm currently doing a series on natural gas in Alberta and BC and green LNG. Yeah. So I'll have you on for an interview, and I'm sure we will have a very spirited discussion. I look forward to that. But let's wrap up this the indigenous law in Wetsuweten and the Coastal GasLink story. Where do we go from here? I mean, how do we avoid this kind of thing in the future? And what role do you expect to play in that?
Well, we need proper dialogue and discussion. That's what the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is all about. It's free, prior, and informed consent, and it's respecting the law. It's respecting the Constitution. It's respecting the Supreme Court decisions, and it's respecting our obligations that we've signed on to in the United Nations. And that requires hard work. It requires dialogue, and it requires making sure that we do get the consent and not conceding and not acquiescing to, you know, something that's a foregone conclusion and being shoved down the throats of Indigenous people. They also need other options. I mean, having this be the only option where you take money from these destructive environmentally destructive extraction projects, or you get nothing, when you know, the billions of dollars that have gone into subsidies on this could be rolled into clean energy projects that First Nations could be benefiting from for decades and decades to come. We need other options for First Nations for economic development.
Fair enough. I look forward to our next chat about various energy issues and probably on this issue as well. So thank you very much for taking your time out on Family Day in BC. We look forward to chatting with you again.
Okay, thanks, Markham.